Arnie, good morning, and let me start by offering my condolences. I know you lost your Uncle Harry this past week, and we are going to have an encore play of the Uncle Harry show that we did in 2015.
It was one of our early shows.
It was.
It's when we were on the other station, in fact.
KMPT.
KMPT. Yes, Uncle Harry passed away the way he wanted to pass away, the way I would want to pass away, the way probably you would want to pass away. He was getting close to being 97. He had just moved in the past year or so into assisted living, which he didn't like. He was getting frail, but his mental faculties were fully there. In fact, his last night, he went out with his daughter, Eileen, who was a guest on our show, Harry Waterstone.
Yes.
Who works for Steve Martin. They went out to dinner for Chinese food, one of his favorites. Came back and watched Jeopardy, and Eileen said he answered most of the questions correctly before the guests did. And then he watched some Dodger baseball in the news, went to sleep, and never woke up.
Wow.
So it's the end of an era, for me at least, for somebody who, was born in 1921.
Right.
And had ties. When you think about it, he left great-great-grandchildren.
Sure.
And he knew his grandparents. So he was connected to 7 generations of the family.
Oh, my God.
And
what happens when you're 97?
There's a lot of things on the show about how they came here at the he's a quintessential American immigrant success story. Just what the American dream is supposed to be all about, contrary to what the Bush administration wants to say about immigrants and
Trump administration.
Excuse me, the Trump administration. Yes,
it's a fair mistake.
I was thinking backwards. What the Trump administration is trying to do.
Right.
His father was the youngest. He was the youngest of 8 brothers and sisters.
Right.
They moved here. His parents moved here after World War I. And to be in the family, his brothers, his grandfather's brother had been in the women's shoe business, and they came over here for a job. He was the only member of the family that immigrated here from Poland to be born in the United States.
Sure.
Only member to go to college.
He's the first in a lot of ways.
First in a lot of ways, and that was part of the American dream. His name was anglicized at Ellis Island.
Waterstone.
Yeah, they call him Waterstone, but the name was Wasserstein from Poland. He remembers at 6 years old looking up in the sky and watching for Lindbergh flying over.
Oh, my gosh.
1927. I thought back about what his life transversed. The year he was born was the first year of regular radio programming. WOR in New York launched in 1921, the year he was born.
Wow.
So, he was at the
1921.
Right, 1921. It's a long time ago.
When was the last time you spoke to Arnie?
A few days before he passed away.
Okay.
He was lamenting the Trump administration. He basically said in not so many words, I didn't go fight at Iwo Jima and stay in the Marines. He rose to a rank of a major. His last years in the reserve, he was doing duty at the Pentagon.
Sure.
He was a true American patriot and hero, but he said, I didn't go and fight in Iwo Jima and contract malaria and dengue fever and all that to see somebody like this disrespect the American, dream.
Yeah.
And that was
he had that right.
He was angry about that, but other than that, he lived a very satisfying life. The things that he saw in his lifetime amazed him, from telephone, which was relatively new, to radio, to the birth of TV, to color television, to Man on the Moon, which we thought was unbelievable.
Right.
He talked about that on a number of occasions. To the technology of the internet, which he was, was confounding.
Did he have a
him.
smartphone?
He did not have a smartphone.
Really?
No. But he had a phone and
he had a
computer.
Phone.
He had a computer.
He had a computer,
and he was on his computer. He had an AOL account, I think. But
they still exist.
They still exist. I still have one. I think I didn't close. He got to see his great-great-grandchildren, which are unbelievable.
Was he a religious man?
He wasn't a religious man, but he was a spiritual man, and he was a thoughtful person. He was very, he dropped out of college to go fight in World War II.
Right.
And we know all the funny stories about that, and how he went to fight Nazis and he ended up fighting the Japanese and going to Guadalcanal. But he transversed many things and really covered one of the most amazing parts of American history. And he is part of that generation that Tom Brokaw calls the greatest generation. Because at 19 years old in college, he decided to leave, go and join the Army before the United States got in the war, because he knew that the Nazis were not right. He knew that they were going to, try to dominate the world. His father wouldn't even talk to him.
He knew.
His father was so angry that he was leaving college to go fight, and go into the Marines. They didn't talk to him. He didn't talk to him till after Pearl Harbor.
Really?
Yeah. So it was, 6 months. His father was angry with him for giving it up and going in the Marines. They didn't even know what the Marines were. He mentioned, in the show that at the time he joined the Marines, there were less men in the Marines than in the New York City Police Department. So he was a pioneer in many ways, in many respects.
Well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have an encore. All right, an encore presentation.
Out of respect to Harry Waterstone.
Out of respect to Harry Waterstone, we're going to go back in the Wayback Machine to November 20th, 2015, where Arnie was one of our first shows, and we spoke with Uncle Harry, and it was really fun. It was enlightening, and then, of course, we spoke with his daughter later on, your cousin, and that was equally a fun conversation. And you are listening to What Do You Know, proudly supported and sponsored by Don Maddox and Engel and Volker's Premium Real Estate here in Western Montana. We are back with the Encore presentation. This is Scott Richmond
and Arnie Sherman.
You're listening to What Do You Know on Newstalk KGVO, AM 1290 and 98.3 FM. Arnie, good morning, and let me start by offering my condolences. I know you lost your Uncle Harry this past week, and we are going to have an encore play of the Uncle Harry show that we did in 2015.
It was one of our early shows.
It was.
It's when we were on the other station, in fact.
KMPT.
KMPT. Yes, Uncle Harry passed away the way he wanted to pass away, the way I would want to pass away, the way probably you would want to pass away. He was getting close to being 97. He had just moved in the past year or so into assisted living, which he didn't like. He was getting frail, but his mental faculties were fully there. In fact, his last night, he went out with his daughter, Eileen, who was a guest on our show, Eileen Waterstone.
Yes.
Who works for Steve Martin. They went out to dinner for Chinese food, one of his favorites. Came back and watched Jeopardy, and Eileen said he answered most of the questions correctly before the guests did. And then he watched some Dodger baseball in the news, went to sleep, and never woke up.
Wow.
So it's the end of an era, for me at least, for somebody who, was born in 1921.
Right.
And had ties. When you think about it, he left great-great-grandchildren.
Sure.
And he knew his grandparents. So he was connected to 7 generations of the family.
Oh, my God.
And
what happens when you're 97?
There's a lot of things on the show about how they came here at the he's a quintessential American immigrant success story. Just what the American dream is supposed to be all about, contrary to what the Bush administration wants to say about immigrants and immigration.
Trump administration.
Excuse me, the Trump administration. Yes,
it's a fair mistake.
I was thinking backwards. What the Trump administration is trying to do.
Right.
His father was the youngest. He was the youngest of 8 brothers and sisters.
Right.
They moved here. His parents moved here after World War I. And to be in the family, his brothers, his grandfather's brother had been in the women's shoe business, and they came over here for a job. He was the only member of the family that immigrated here from Poland to be born in the United States.
Sure.
Only member to go to college.
He's the first in a lot of ways.
First in a lot of ways, and that was part of the American dream. His name was anglicized at Ellis Island.
Waterstone.
Yeah, they call him Waterstone, but the name was Wasserstein from Poland. You know, he remembers at 6 years old looking up in the sky and watching for Lindbergh flying over.
Oh, my gosh.
1927. You know, I thought back about what his life transversed. You know, the year he was born was the first year of regular radio programming. WOR in New York launched in 1921, the year he was born.
Wow.
So, I mean, he was at the beginning.
1921.
Right, 1921. It's a long time ago.
When was the last time you spoke to him, Arnie?
A few days before he passed away.
Okay.
He was lamenting the Trump administration. You know, he basically said in not so many words, I didn't go fight at Iwo Jima and stay in the Marines. You know, he rose to be a rank of a major. His last years in the reserve, he was doing duty at the Pentagon.
Sure.
He was a true American patriot and hero, but he said, I didn't go and fight in Iwo Jima and contract malaria and dengue fever and all that to see somebody like this disrespect the American, you know, dream.
Yeah.
You know, and that was
he had that right.
You know, he was angry about that, but other than that, he lived a very satisfying life. The things that he saw in his lifetime amazed him, from telephone, you know, which was relatively new, to radio, to the birth of TV, to color television, to Man on the Moon, which we thought was unbelievable.
Right.
You know, he talked about that on a number of occasions. To the technology of the internet, which he was, you know, was confounding.
Did he have a
to him.
smartphone?
He did not have a smartphone.
Really?
But but he had a phone and
he had a
computer.
phone.
He had a computer.
He had a computer,
and he was on his computer. He had an AOL account, I think. But
they still exist.
They still exist. I still have one. I think I didn't close. You know, he got to see his great-great-grandchildren, which are unbelievable.
Was he a religious man?
He wasn't a religious man, but he was a spiritual man, and he was a thoughtful person. He was very, you know, he dropped out of college to go fight in World War II. Right. You know, and you know, we know all the funny stories about that, and how he went to fight Nazis and he ended up fighting the Japanese and going to Guadalcanal. But he transversed many things and really covered one of the most amazing parts of American history. And he is part of that generation that Tom Brokaw calls the greatest generation. Because at 19 years old in college, he decided to leave, go and join the Army before the United States got in the war, because he knew that the Nazis were not right. You know, he knew that they were going to, try to dominate the world. His father wouldn't even talk to him.
He knew.
His father was so angry that he was leaving college to go fight, and go into the Marines. They didn't talk to him. He didn't talk to him till after Pearl Harbor.
Really?
Yeah. So it was, 6 months. His father was angry with him for giving it up and going in the Marines. They didn't even know what the Marines were. He mentioned, in the show that at the time he joined the Marines, there were less men in the Marines than in the New York City Police Department. So he was a pioneer in many ways, in many respects.
Well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have an encore. All right, an encore presentation.
Out of respect to Harry Waterstone.
Out of respect to Harry Waterstone, we're going to go back in the Wayback Machine to November 20th, 2015, where Arnie was one of our first shows, and we spoke with Uncle Harry, and it was really fun. It was enlightening, and then, of course, we spoke with his daughter later on, your cousin, and that was equally a fun conversation. And you are listening to What Do You Know, proudly supported and sponsored by Don Maddox and Engel and Volker's Premium Real Estate here in Western Montana. We are back with the encore presentation.
I'm doing good, Scott. On our last show, we were talking about scary things and Halloween, and I mentioned that I was really scared by 3D printers.
Right.
And you asked me why, and I'm going to tell you why.
So curious.
I'm sure you are curious. you know, we live in a world now where there's a lot of things around us that we don't know how they even work or operate, right? I don't even know how radio works. I mean, you turn your radio on and you get music coming out of the air somewhere. I mean, and that's been around for a long time. I still don't understand that. 3D printers, sure. It's sort of the latest in a series of great inventions, are doing things that are miraculous, but also I really think, you know, scary. I was reading lately that a boy used a 3D printer to make a hand and win an arm wrestling competition.
How is that possible?
I don't know how. I that's what I'm trying to say. I don't know how that's possible. They're doing 3D printing of human parts. They're making hair out of with 3D printers.
You and I could use that.
They're regrowing skulls with 3D printers. You know, and I don't know how it works. I don't know how radio works. I don't know how an iPad with no moving parts can watch movies and all these sorts of things. And so I started thinking about understanding, you know, your surroundings. 200 years ago, when there were 8 million people in the United States, things were pretty simple. We had flintlock pistols and rifles. We had cannons. We had, maybe even the beginning of a steam engine, and that was about it in terms of advancement and development.
Right, sure.
100 years ago, even before that, in 1893, at the World's Fair, I was at the Smithsonian, and they had an exhibition from the 1893 World's Fair that showed the best of what was available at that time. And it was shocking to me how little things had advanced even at that point in time. Mm-hmm. You know, there was a cotton gin, there was a steam engine, there was a bigger cannon. You know, and that was it. 100 years ago in the United States, there were 100 million people. We went from 8 million people in 1815 to 100 million people in 1915. And not really that much had changed. I mean, World War I came along, and there was a lot of innovation as a result of World War I. But 100 years ago, things were much more simpler than they are today, a lot less complex. At least that's my thinking about it. And things have developed so rapidly, I thought we might want to talk about the last 100 years of development from a personal perspective. You know, from coming down from 30,000 feet, let's talk about it from personal experience. And then I thought, I know of no one better to help talk about that than Harry Waterstone, who happens to be my 94-year-old uncle. He has led a very interesting and memorable life so far. He hit a home run in the Polo Grounds when he was a kid. In July 4th, 1939, he was at Yankee Stadium when Lou Gehrig gave his famous "I'm the luckiest man on the face of the earth" speech. He was in World War II at Guadalcanal. He was part of the 1st Marine Division that won a unit citation, which hasn't been given out very often in history. It's the entire unit engaged in behavior that was above and beyond the call of duty and in heroic activities. He introduced Harry Truman when he was running for president in Boise, Idaho. He was a sportscaster and sports announcer. He covered minor league baseball at games that he wasn't even at. They were on the road. He would cover it by looking at the ticker tape from the game and trying to recreate the excitement of a baseball game from looking at ticker tape. He, in the 50s through the 80s, he was an advertising, marketing, PR person in Las Vegas. He was in Vegas during the heyday of what was happening in that city with a tremendous amount of stories. So he
must be a great storyteller.
He's a great storyteller, and he's almost like a true-life version of Zelig or Forrest Gump, at least for me personally. I never get tired of talking to Uncle Harry and hearing about his life experiences. And I'm going to ask him to talk about enlisting in 1940 in the Marines. He went to the Marines, interestingly enough, because they were the only group that had actual guns. And he said if he was going to go fight the Germans, unfortunately for him,
guns.
He ended up going into the Pacific Theater. He needed guns, and the Army didn't have guns, and only the Marines had actual guns in training. And he had never fired a gun in his life. So he's got lots of interesting stories. Plus, he's got almost a 100-year perspective. I mean, his family were immigrant family that came to the United States. He was born in 1920, and he's been around for almost 100 years. So I thought he would be a good person to talk about this last 100 years from a personal perspective.
How much can we learn? And that's the most important thing. When you look back at history, how much does it inform what's happening today and the future? Right? We could learn from history. So he's going to be a great guest.
I'm very excited to share my uncle with our listening audience.
Well, we thank you, and we're looking forward to that. Right after this break, we're going to talk to Harry Waterstone on What Do You Know with Scott and Arnie. You are listening to What Do You Know with Scott and Arnie. On our phone, we have a great guest, Harry Waterstone.
Uncle Harry, I'm glad you can join us today on the radio.
Thank you. I'm delighted to join you.
So Scott and I have been talking about the last 100 years. And we said there was nobody better to comment on that period of time than you.
Thank you. I hope my memory serves me and the two of you well.
Well, we're going to test that. So tell us a little bit about a kid growing up in New York in the 1920s and 30s.
Okay, 1920s and 30s.
Yes, when you were growing up in New York City.
Well, as you know, I was born in 1921.
Yes.
I was part of a very large family. I had 5 brothers, 2 sisters. And I was, of course, the youngest. I was the only born in the United States. My father, mother, and my siblings were all born in Poland. And there was almost a 10-year gap between me and the next youngest, my brother Al. And the way that occurred, as I got the story from my brothers and sisters and relatives, my family all came over from a small village called Szydłowiec in Poland. And Szydłowiec, even today, is still known for manufacturing high-quality ladies' shoes, primarily. My father was involved in that business, but his older brother had come to the United States in around 1908, and he established a small factory on the Lower East Side of New York City. He was manufacturing ladies' shoes primarily for what was then a very prominent American shoe manufacturing company called I. Miller and Company.
Sure.
And at one point, he wrote a letter to my father and said, I have it from someone who I'm inclined to believe that another war is coming to Europe, which wasn't hard to believe. And he said, I want you to start making preparations to come to the United States. I will guarantee you a place to live and a job. And as soon as you're settled, we'll bring Ida, your wife, and the 7 children to come and join us. So my father made the preparations, and he came to the United States, as I understand, sometime in the year of 1912. But before he could make the arrangements, or his brother could make the arrangements to bring the rest of the family, World War I intervened. So the rest of my family didn't come to the United States until 1920. And I was born in 1921.
So they came through Ellis Island and changed your name.
Yes, and sometime in 1920. Right. I don't.
And they changed your family name because it was Wasserstein, wasn't it?
Pardon?
Your family name was Wasserstein, and when you came to America, they changed it to Waterstone.
Well, they changed it at Ellis Island. I guess one of the immigration authorities, he took a literal translation from Wasserstein to Waterstone, and that became our name.
So how did you end up hitting a home run in the Polo Grounds? Tell us that story.
It was I played baseball for Evander Childs High School, which was in the Bronx. City championship, we were one of the finalists, and we were playing Erasmus High, which was in Brooklyn,
right,
for the city championship. Well, because they were from Brooklyn, we couldn't schedule the game in Ebbets Field. Because I was from a school in the Bronx, we couldn't schedule the game in Yankee Stadium. So a neutral field, obviously, was the Polo Grounds. Well, the Polo Grounds, if either one or both of you recall or know, had the most peculiar foul balls or down the line, and left field was only 278 feet. Bobby Thompson, many years later, hit the home run heard around the world. Mine was only heard in the remote parts of the Bronx and Brooklyn. But in any other stadium, it would have been a fly out to left field.
But in the Polo Grounds, it was a home run.
The Polo Grounds, I hit a home run, and we won the city championship in 1938. I was 17 years old.
So the next year, you got to listen to one of the most famous speeches that were ever given in sports at Yankee Stadium when Lou Gehrig gave his famous retirement speech.
That was in 1939.
Yes.
July 4th, 1939. Yeah, you're correct. Well, I was one of something over 55,000 people. Obviously, it was a sold-out game because everyone expected Lou Gehrig to make his announcement that is now remembered by millions because of the movie that came later with Gary Cooper.
Right.
But I was there in 1939.
So the war didn't break out really here till 41, but you enlisted in the Marines.
1940, by coincidence, on a date that became infamous, September 11th. September 11th, 1940, I took the oath.
And why did you choose the Marines?
In 1940, I was at the City College of New York. For some reason, I was convinced, I was absolutely sure that we were going to get into the war. The war was on in Europe. Of course, the war started in Europe in 1939. But I was sure we were going to get into the war, and my classmates, my friends, they all thought I was talking nonsense. That we had a big ocean between us and Europe, and it wasn't our war. But I differed with them, and I did it very vocally because a lot of people wouldn't talk to me, including my father. Anyway, I went down to 90 Church Street, where they had the recruiting stations for the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, maybe the Coast Guard.
I want you to tell us more about the Marines when we come back. You are listening to What Do You Know with Scott and Arnie on KMPT and 930KMPT.com. Back with Harry Waterstone right after this. You're listening to What Do You Know with Scott and Arnie on KMPT and 930KMPT.com with our guest, Harry Waterstone.
So you chose the Marines for what reason?
Well, when I decided to join the military, naturally the first place I went to was the Army recruiting station. When I thought about military, I only thought about the Army. And so I went to the Army recruiting station, and the sergeant was talking to another young man. And so he said, just wait, I'll be with you in a moment. And they had some newspaper tear sheets pinned to a cork wall. So I went over just because I had nothing else to do, I guess. And even to this day, I'll never understand why they put this up. But they had a tear page from the New York World Telegram, one of the many newspapers in New York City at the time. And they had a picture of recruits at Fort Dix, New Jersey, marching, holding broomsticks, literally broomsticks.
Oh, my God.
And I couldn't understand the broomsticks. So when I got to talk to the sergeant, I said, look, I'm just curious, what's with the broomsticks? He said, well, we're waiting for Congress to pass an appropriation so they could buy rifles. And the thought came to me that Hitler was just running wild over any opposition he had in Europe, and I didn't want to go over there with a broomstick.
No, that's for sure.
So I said, excuse me, I said, maybe I'll be back in a few minutes. And I went next door to the Navy. And I walked into the Navy recruiting station, and a thought occurred to me when I was in grade school. They had taken us on an outing to Staten Island, New York, on a ferry. And I remembered being queasy, feeling queasy, on the ferry. And I said, if I join the Navy, there's a good chance that I'm going to be on a ship somewhere, and it's on the ocean.
Yes.
So I excused myself and went next door to the Marine Corps. And the Marine Corps, I had to get tooth fillings,
yes,
before they would give me the oath.
The Marines had guns, though. They had rifles.
Interestingly enough, when I finally took the oath, there were 17,100 Marines, active duty Marines, in the entire world.
Wow.
The New York City Police Department was 28,000. I say, well, I'm going to be safe because it's more dangerous just to live in New York than to be in the Marine Corps.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So anyway, that's how I got into the Marine Corps.
And then you ended up not fighting Germans, but you ended up going to the Pacific Theater and fighting on Guadalcanal.
As a matter of fact, on December 7th, 1941, there were 3 other Marines and I, and one of the Marines, 1934 or 33 Chevy, with a rumble seat, and we were going back to Parris Island, South Carolina, where we were stationed, and the car, I was in a rumble seat, and the car pulled over on the side of the road, and the driver jumped out, and he said, hey, guys, I just heard on the radio that the Japanese bombed some place called Pearl Harbor. We had no idea where it was. I don't think we knew where Hawaii was.
Well, it wasn't even a state then.
I mean, when I joined the military, I thought surely I'd be in Europe fighting Nazis.
Right.
I never thought about the Japanese. I mean, the Japanese situation didn't start to heat up until just a couple of months before Pearl Harbor. We went to Guadalcanal, but we went to New Zealand first.
Right.
Where the division joined up the forward echelon and the rear echelon. The forward echelon went through the Panama Canal from Charleston, South Carolina. We went by train across the United States, and I never thought we'd get out of Texas. I mean, every day when we got off to do a little exercise, we were still in Texas, still in Texas.
Right.
I thought the Japanese had invaded from the Pacific side,
Yeah.
and we were going to meet them in Texas.
Right.
But we went aboard ship in San Francisco, and we didn't know where we were going until we were 10 days out. And then they told us we're going to New Zealand to regroup. So we were there not too long, and we set sail for Guadalcanal. We stopped in Fiji for a couple of practice landings, and on August the 7th, the first troops landed on Guadalcanal. I was with an artillery, the 11th Marines. We landed on August the 8th.
Wow. And you were there how long?
Well, I was evacuated 2 days after Thanksgiving because I had malaria. And then they said I also had a touch of dengue fever. I didn't know what the difference was, quite honestly.
Right.
So I was evacuated via Australia, Brisbane, Australia, to a hospital in Wellington, New Zealand, for 4 weeks at Cape Gloucester, which was in New Britain.
Right.
They say it's the rainiest spot on the face of the earth.
Yeah.
And if my memory serves me correctly, I had no reason to doubt it. It never stopped raining.
Right. Right. So you served 6 years in the Marines. After active combat, they send you a nice New York guy to Butte, Montana. And
I came back to the United States in 1944, and I was married the day I got back into New York. But I went back to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and I was scheduled to go back into what they called the Infantry Training Regiment, preparatory to being sent overseas again, when the directive came in from the office of the commandant. This was in 1945. The Marine Corps wanted to start opening what they called second city recruiting stations that they had closed during the war, and there were certain criteria that people had to meet before they could be recommended by the commanders for recruiting duty, and I met those criteria. I had the criteria, and I was recommended, and I was assigned to recruiting duty. And I remember that with the recommendation, they also had to include a place where the applicants or the nominees, if they were selected, would have the easiest location where they could find a place to live, because you had to live in the civilian quarters.
Right.
So I put down New York. My wife was in New York. My in-laws were in New York. I had family in New York. So they assigned me. I got recruiting duty assigned to the Western Recruiting Division, headquarters San Francisco, California. There they asked again, where in the Western Recruiting Division could I find a place to live? Well, I had a sister in Los Angeles, so I said Los Angeles. So they assigned me to Portland, Oregon. So they assigned me to Butte, Montana. I was there only 2 months.
What was Butte like then in 1945?
In Portland, it was very difficult to find a place to live, but I finally did, and my wife came out from New York to join me. And I didn't know what the situation would be in Butte, but I had a reference from some friends that we made in Portland to Dr. Rayfish, a dentist and his family in Butte. So I contacted them when we moved into a hotel temporarily in Butte, and I said I needed a place to live, and they said, well, right across the street from where we live, there's a very nice apartment building, the Muller Apartments. So we'll pick you up and we'll introduce you to the manager. I don't remember her name. And when they introduced me, she said, well, we have a 4-story building. If we have an elevator, what floor would you like your apartment on? And I thought she was being sarcastic. I didn't realize that there were apartments everywhere in Butte because so many people had been working only. What is the big copper? Is it the Anaconda Copper?
Right. It's now Montana Resources, but it was Anaconda Copper in those days.
Well, they had been working in the copper mines, and when all of the much better jobs opened on the Pacific Coast, in shipyards and so forth, a lot of the people left Butte, Montana. So there were empty apartments everywhere. So we took the top floor, and then it was furnished with everything, including dishes, for $40 a month.
You're listening to What Do You Know with Scott and Arnie with our guest, Harry Waterstone. We're back with What Do You Know on Missoula's KMPT AM and online and on demand on 930kmpt.com. As we continue this Veterans Day week conversation with retired Marine Major, 94-year-old Harry Waterstone, we have a lot of questions. Harry?
Yes.
You have a great deal of experience in the radio business, and I want you to tell us about covering the Pioneer League baseball and announcing for Boise College. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. During World War II, all minor league baseball was suspended. There weren't enough people around. Anyway, shortly after the war ended, minor league baseball started to come back in a limited way, and that included the Pioneer League, which was a sea league covering cities primarily in Utah, Montana, and Idaho. And Boise had a team, the Boise Pilots. The radio station that I joined when I came off active duty, KGVO in Boise, got the baseball the rights to the ball games, and Fentress Kuhn, who was the station owner and manager, asked me if I knew anything about baseball, and I had played in high school. And I said, yeah, I know baseball. He said, you're it.
And you were the play-by-play guy, right? You were the play-by-play guy?
That's how I started. It was in 1947. And I did that until I was offered a job in Los Angeles, and so I did it from 1947 through 1954.
So what happened with when we had road games? How did you cover those?
When they were away, we did recreations, which incidentally Ronald Reagan did in Illinois at the same time that I was doing it in Boise, Idaho. And that was interesting. The most difficult thing was if there was a short rain delay, you had to fill until the rain delay was either stopped or the ball game was suspended.
How did you get the information? Was it on ticker tape, or how did you know what was going on? You weren't at the game.
With Western Union. Western Union transmitted from wherever the team was playing to a Western Union operator sitting in the press box, and he would get the strips off his receiver and paste them down so that I could read whatever was being sent, and of course I would embroider to make it more interesting for the listener.
Is that a telegraph?
Unbelievable.
So forget about phoning it in. That's telegraphing it in.
Telegraphing it in. That's incredible that you were able to do that, and you did it for that long.
The longer I did it, I think, the more adept I became, I hope. but it was very popular and enabled me to meet a lot of people in Boise.
Oh, that's for sure.
Got to know me that way. I also did the football games for, at that time, Boise Junior College, which has become Boise State University.
Yes.
Sure.
With its blue football field.
Yes.
Yeah, no, that's what we play them.
Yes.
So when it was Boise Junior College, it did not have a blue football field.
No, we know that back in those days.
Do you know why it's blue?
No.
One of the prominent citizens in Boise was a lady named Margaret Ailshire. She was, and her family was, the publisher of the Idaho Daily Statesman, the newspaper in Boise. She was instrumental in getting Boise Junior College to prosper and advance and become a Boise State University. And as I got the story, her favorite color was blue. She always, whatever she was wearing, something would be blue. And after she passed away, as a memorial to her memory, they decided they would have a blue football field.
Wow,
Beautiful.
that's great. So I think it would be interesting for the listeners to talk about working in Las Vegas in the 50s and 60s and 70s. What was Vegas like back then?
Vegas was a very interesting place. The bosses that you worked with were very interesting. I had some wonderful experiences. In the agency, as the agency grew, we started out representing one hotel, the Riviera, the Stardust, the Aladdin. We had a lot of experience in Las Vegas. When the Stardust was almost completed, the building of the Stardust Hotel, the principal owner had started in the gambling business. He owned the gambling ship 3 miles off the coast of Los Angeles. So he and some associates were building the Stardust Hotel, and when it was almost completed, he had a heart attack. And he and his associates just faded away from the project. So a gentleman named John Factor, who was the black sheep, a member of the Max Factor cosmetic company.
Yes.
People, not to his face, called him Jake the Barber. He had been...
Jake the Barber.
Jake the Barber. He had been convicted many years earlier in Illinois for suborning a jury. And he had served 4 years of a 6-year sentence. But he emerged from prison and became a very, very successful entrepreneur. So he bought what was then the Stardust Hotel and agreed to assume whatever debts and complete the construction. And he hired us as an agency to do all of the preliminary brochures and that kind of material. And I got a call from him one morning, and they hired a gentleman named Tony Dwan, and he didn't want to, as the entertainment director, and he didn't want to bring to the Stardust Hotel the same kind of entertainment that all the hotels on the Strip had. You know, an entertainer that they would change about every 3 to 4 weeks for another entertainer. He brought the Lido di Paris show, the review, from Paris, which entailed different kind of theater. It had to have an elevator to bring up different scenes. So that entailed a change in a brochure that was almost finished. And that involved changing four pages, which involved an increase in the cost of. So I called Mr. Factor and told him, and he got back to me a couple of days later, and he said, I think we should go up to Las Vegas and expose the additional expense to the people at the Desert Inn. Now, that's the first time we knew that the Desert Inn had anything to do with the Stardust.
Right. You were in L.A. You were in L.A. at the time, right?
Pardon?
You were in L.A. at the time. You were in Los Angeles.
I was in Los Angeles
Yes.
with an advertising agency.
Right.
So I said, what has the Desert Inn got to do with it? He said, well, they have the gambling license. He couldn't get a gambling license because he was a convicted felon, Mr. Factor.
Yes.
So I said, well, the expense is going to be about, I forget, $12,000-$14,000. And he said, I think we should fly up to, and I didn't want to go to Vegas. I was going up about once a week. And I remember it was in the summertime. Anyway, he said, you'll meet me with your art director tomorrow morning at Western Airlines. That was so long ago they were still having prop jets. So we met him, and we got on a plane, and they seated us in first class. It was only an hour and 12-minute flight. And I was sitting across the aisle from Mr. Factor when the plane took off and someone pulled the curtain behind us.
Yes.
And he leaned over and he said something like, I'm glad you're flying with me this morning. And I said, well, it's my pleasure. He said, I don't mean that. Why do they always pull a curtain? and I wondered, where is this man from? I said, well, John, Mr. Factor, I said, it's simply to separate first class from coach. And he looked at me, and then he said, what is coach? And I didn't know how to answer that. I said, it's simply to separate. Anyway, we got to Las Vegas. They flew us. They met us with a limo from the Desert Inn. We got to the hotel, and we got into a private elevator, went to the mezzanine, and the young lady sitting outside said, Mr. Factor, they're expecting you. And we went right in, Factor, myself, and my art director. And a gentleman stood up at the head of the table and said something like, welcome. And he had a Yiddish accent like you could expect on a stage in New York City. And he said, hello, come right in, and introduce your friends. And he introduced us to a Mr. Kleinman. And Mr. Kleinman said, all right, have a seat. And he said, well, what are we looking at? So he unrolled the sheets that had to be redone. And he said, so what are we talking about? What how much more? So I said 12 or 14,000, I forget. And he looked at John and he said, John, for this, you couldn't make a telephone call. Anyway, so and someone interrupted Mr. Kleinman, and he said, we have to make a decision on this today. That's the only way we can buy it for $250,000. And Mr. Kleinman said to him without hesitation, don't you see we have guests? Why are you bothering me with nickels and dimes?
That's the way it was.
Even way back then, and even now, I would be impressed with $250,000 being called nickels and dimes.
Yeah, what year was that?
It'll be 1968.
So in 68, $250,000 was nickels and dimes.
In Vegas.
Whatever it was.
Yeah.
Anyway, he said, look, go ahead and, he says, we have to do it. I said, yes, sir, we have to do it. He said, so we'll do it. He said, John, go down with your friends, have a bite. They'll come down in about an hour.
Sure.
So when we got outside, I asked Mr. Factor, who is Mr. Kleinman? He said, he's from Cleveland. He's the big boss. Anyway, 6 months later, my wife and I were watching the news when the Key Farber Committee was doing an investigation of skimming in Las Vegas.
Yes.
When witness comes walking in with two lawyers, it's Mr. Kleinman. and someone said to him, please raise your right hand, and do you swear to the whole thing? The oath. I certainly do.
That's a great story, Uncle.
But those are the kinds of people we did business with in Las Vegas. A lot of it on a handshake. Never got stuck a dime.
Wow, that's good. That's good to know. So, Uncle, let me switch gears here a little bit. You've lived a very interesting, colorful, exciting life. So tell us a little bit about what are the greatest changes you've seen from growing up in New York in the 30s and 20s and 30s, and now living in Los Angeles in 2015.
Yes, we are. I can't believe it. It's hard for me to pick any one thing. You have to understand that in all these years, I've seen a lot of things. Each one as they came along was a source of amazement for me. I can remember when Lucky Lindy landed in Paris in 1927. I was only 6 years old, but I remember the excitement. Every time we saw a plane in the sky, the kids would point up and say, "Oh, look, there's Lindy."
Wow.
But, in more recent times, so many marvelous things have happened that I'm still in awe. Certainly the computer age, the exploration of space, the manned exploration of space, astronauts on the moon. How could you not be absolutely incredulous at what an achievement that was?
Sure.
And now, coming back down to earth, I still don't understand how the iPhones work or the iPads.
Right.
A couple of years ago, my daughter was in Africa on a safari. She called me, and my first reaction was, "Are you back home?" She said, "No, I'm calling you from Kenya."
Yes.
My God, I said, "From Kenya?" It was like she was calling me from next door.
Wow.
I
Yep.
still don't understand. I'm not reluctant to confess. I have no idea how it works except with satellites. But I don't know how satellites work, but they work. It made the world so small that whatever happens anywhere eventually has to have an effect, a significant effect,
Right.
on 90% of the world's population. It's absolutely remarkable. And what's down the line? How can anybody possibly predict or call it impossible or even improbable? Can't do that anymore.
That's true. That's true. What's the hardest thing to adjust to for you over the years?
I've had some wonderful things to adjust to, and I've had some sad things, but that's everyone's lifetime. Getting married to a young lady that I had known since we were both less than teenagers, having children, my military service.
So, and you stayed in the military for how long? You stayed in after.
I was on active duty from 1940 to 1946, and then I went into the reserve and stayed in the reserve until active reserve until 1974. So that was one of the best things I did, as it turns out, because my benefits, particularly my medical care benefits, are absolutely invaluable to me.
And you had a chance just recently, in the not too recent past, to go back and see the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C., didn't you?
Yes, I did. I actually saw it the first time when it was only open a year. The Masonic fraternity, a couple of years ago, reached out, the Grand Master of California, reached out to contact as many Masons who were World War II veterans, and they flew us back on Alaska Airlines to Washington, all expenses paid, for 4 days. We visited the World War II Memorial and all the other memorials, the Lincoln Memorial, the Korean War Memorial, the Vietnam Wall. It was a marvelous, marvelous experience.
How did it make you feel when you saw all that? Did it bring back memories? And
yes, it certainly did. Talking about my last 12 years in the active reserve, my active duty, my 2 weeks or more active duty every year that I had to perform were at the Pentagon. So I was in Washington a lot. And I think Washington is one city that Americans on vacation should absolutely visit. Not only is it spectacular in what it offers the visitor, but it costs absolutely nothing to visit some of the cornerstones of our republic.
Sure.
So, and I don't understand where people can visit all places that they consider they must see, and they've never seen Washington, D.C. I just don't understand that.
yeah, it is. It's tremendous. It's one of the best values for our taxpayer money to be able to look and see all of that. The mall, all the monuments, the collection at the Smithsonian, what's available at the East Wing Art Gallery, the Air and Space Museum. All those things are fabulous.
And let's not forget the Vietnam Memorial
Yes.
being Veterans Day this
Practically
week.
nothing.
Uncle Harry, give us, in closing, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future? What are your thoughts?
I can't even imagine the advances that will be made. And I certainly hope that whatever happens has a positive effect on the generations coming after mine. Because I have grandchildren, I have great-grandchildren, and fortunately and unbelievably for me, I have 2 great-great-grandchildren. And I want this to be a world in which they can grow and prosper and lead healthy, productive lives. That's what I hope for the future.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. Uncle, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
We were just visiting with retired Marine Major Harry Waterstone. You've been listening to What Do You Know with Scott and Arnie. We'll see you again next week. Thank you for listening to What Do You Know?
I can't wait for the next show, Scott.
I'm excited too, Arnie. If you'd like to suggest a guest, send me an email at scottrichmond@townsquaremedia.com. We'll see you next week. And thanks for listening to Newstalk KGVO.